All right, let me tell everyone what's ahead. I'm going to get the gong. Do we have a gong? Do we have the bell? Anyone remember the Gong Show? Am I dating myself? Yeah, all right, probably. All right, listen, we thank you all again for your attention. I love to hear the engagement, so that bodes well for the breakout sessions, which will enable you to have some Q&A as well. I just want to give you an overview of what to expect this afternoon. We're really going to have just a fireside chat format that is going to adhere to FDR's principle of be brief, be sincere, and be seated. I'm going to ask that the executives as well speak in English so that we can understand, because we're talking about some really science-intensive things. They can get in the weeds, but they know how to explain that to us laymen in these terms, and I think that's important for us to understand the big picture of these opportunities. Again, this is about Discovery Day. This is about sometimes discovering for the first time, rediscovering certain companies, and you have to do that from a place of understanding first before we can dig deeper. So this is not meant to be exhaustive. This is meant to introduce you to new opportunities so that you can begin that process. I'm fortunate to have up here a man who will not reveal to you his secret for staying young, because he's actually 85 and he looks like he's 55. He's working as a director on some secret company that he's not sharing with us yet, but it is the fountain of youth. But good to see you, my friend Eric.
Good to see you.
Just a quick intro here before we jump into the conversation about Gain Therapeutics, which I believe you were the original CEO and then transitioned to the board, correct?
Right, that's right.
Okay, so this is another legitimate AI play. I had just read a headline today from Singularity Hub about a company that has now developed the first AI-based drug that has just gotten through phase 2 clinical trials. And they were really playing that up, but Gain is doing something very similar. So I'm not going to get deep in the science here, because if I remember correctly, we could confuse ourselves really quickly. If I look at the tagline, I think we have some marketing people in here too. So unfolding the next generation of allosteric small molecule treatments for neurodegenerative diseases. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to give you an analogy, and you can validate it or not. My understanding of Gain's platform, which is revolutionary, they use AI and machine learning to identify drug compounds that would work for rare diseases that are usually the result of a protein misfolding.
Yes.
And then because that protein is misfolded, downstream from that protein, it causes a lot of negative things to happen. So my analogy, which is going to be overly simplified, which I want you to correct me if I'm completely wrong, is when I used to have a yard and I had my hose out there and it would get kinked, and therefore the water wouldn't flow anymore. It messed me up. I couldn't do what I needed to do. What you're doing is essentially developing drugs that unkink that biological kink and allow the body to function as it should.
That's a great analogy.
Awesome.
Yeah. And that kink can be caused by your dog, by your car running over the hose, kids, a variety of things. And this is a very important, it's important to understand that, because proteins, they govern so many things in your body. And it's typically the root cause of disease. And how do these proteins get messed up? It can be genetic, your genes. It could be inflammation. It could be aging. It could be so many different things. And so what we do is we focus on that one pathway between damaged protein and disease. And we're focused on that area, and we try to figure out how can we make that protein work correctly or unkink the hose.
And are you developing novel drugs to do the unfolding of the proteins, or is it known compounds? How are you going about that?
So everything in biotech and medicine is an evolution, right? So the way that these diseases caused by aberrant proteins has been addressed is by giving exogenous protein. So I'm sure everybody's heard of the company Genzyme. This is what they did. Rare disease. You have this rare disease because your protein's not working, and patients get a vial of that protein, or I'm using the word protein enzyme the same, that they get a vial of that enzyme, which is a normal enzyme, and because they don't have a normal protein, you give it to them from that vial, and the disease can be addressed. Now, the next evolution of that is to do that same fixing with small molecules, and that's where Gain fits in. Be able to address that protein, correct protein function, by creating a small molecule that binds to that protein in an irreversible way that basically corrects the misfolding. and the problems associated.
So I want to talk about what you've used this platform. What's the name of the platform again?
It's called Magellan.
Magellan, that's right. I think that was a newly implemented name.
Yes.
See, that's why I didn't know it. I didn't forget. So I want to talk about what your lead clinical asset now is for addressing Parkinson's. So how many people here are familiar with anyone with Parkinson's? Yeah, almost everyone in the room. And from my own research, there's a lot of candidates that are looking to at least slow the progression of Parkinson's. What your lead asset, what Gain's lead asset has done is actually the potential to reverse Parkinson's. So why don't you share with us why targeting Parkinson's first, what you're seeing in the early, the animal models, and now you've just moved into the clinic.
Right. So just a little bit about my background. I spent most of my career developing drugs for diseases that had no cures. And these are orphan drugs, they call them, and for rare diseases. And so, an example is RSV. You hear about this today on the TV about RSV vaccines.
You don't have RSV, right? We're good.
I'm good.
All right.
But we developed the first RSV drug back in 1989. It was the first time that a drug for RSV was licensed, and it was a hyperimmune globulin. So it became, it was a fraction of blood. Now it's a vaccine, so things change over time. But I've spent most of my career developing drugs for diseases you have never heard of. Nobody heard of RSV at that time. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of HAE, but I developed the first drug for hereditary angioedema. Now there are 7 drugs on the market. And this is the first disease that people have ever heard of that I've worked on. So that's so I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining what Parkinson's disease is, but in general, it's a neurodegenerative disease and it's progressive. And when I first started working with Gain, I was working at a venture capital firm, and a very good friend of mine was the founder of the company. He came and told me about this treatment for Parkinson's, and I said, okay, thank you very much, but there are 3,000 clinical studies going on for Parkinson's disease. Why do you think that with your $5 million and your 3 employees that you're going to do better than Merck and Genentech and Amgen and every other major company who is desperate to figure out how to make progress in neurodegenerative diseases? And we just stayed in touch. I thought he was crazy, I would never invest in something so complex and so
Sidebar,
difficult.
You are one of those voices of skepticism and reason a lot of times when we bring things to you too. So it's good to know that it's not just us that you give that to.
Because I love what you guys do because you have big dreams.
Yeah.
You look for transformational technologies, transformational companies, but you have to have a clear regulatory path, clear clinical path, clear science, and all of you guys are very, very focused on that. You don't just sort of blur your eyes and think, okay, well, they'll get there.
Yeah.
So,
you saw those things in Gain, and that's what made you decide to join.
Yes, exactly right. Because what they do, what we're doing at Gain is very similar to what happened 15 years ago in oncology. When you talked about breast cancer, it was like, oh my gosh, somebody has breast cancer, it's terrible. And the patient would go on chemotherapy and everybody would be preparing to make this patient as comfortable as possible. But it wasn't until you were able to genetically define patients that had HER2 positive, HER2 negative, BRCA gene, that you could make any progress in oncology. It's the same thing now in neuroscience and CNS, because Parkinson's is not one disease. It's a neurodegenerative disease. But if you look at biomarkers and populations, and all of this is made public by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And the first time I looked at this, I thought, okay, nobody really knows what's going on here, but there is one little segment of patients that have Parkinson's disease that have a mutation and causes an enzyme to not work. So that's our focus, is a genetically defined population of Parkinson's disease. And that was that was sufficient for me to get from no possible way to, wow, now we have a pathway.
And then fast forward, where are you now? You're getting into you just started the first clinical trial, phase 1.
Just started phase 1.
What's the trial design? How many patients? How long is it going to take?
It's a typical phase 1 study. It's healthy individuals, and we just completed the single ascending dose, and now we're doing multiple ascending doses. So far, everybody's doing well.
No toxicity, side effects, anything like that?
0 so far. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow, but we're quite confident that the product, based on the animal studies that we have done in all of the investigation in various assays and studies that it will be safe in humans.
Talk to me a little bit. You're familiar with Q Biopharma, which we backed, right? So that's really just teaching the body's generating a natural immune response. Is there anything with what Gain's doing? Is it similar to that standpoint where there's lower risk potential because you're essentially giving an enzyme that should unfold a protein and open things up?
It's a very good question, actually. And Q is a great company. If you haven't looked at it, this is a tremendously undervalued company.
I'll give you the $100 later. No, I didn't. I did not say that for any regulator.
There are several companies that are very undervalued because of the dynamics in biotechnology and pharmaceuticals over the past 2 years. But all we're doing is fixing, in a very temporary way, an enzyme that is not in the correct shape. So it's like me trying to walk through that door and my arms are stuck out wide because I have some genetic mutation where I can't put my arms down. Take the pill. Now, all of a sudden, you can put your arms down and walk through the door. That's all we're doing. And so we're not changing, we're not using genetic therapy, we're not gene editing, we're not doing all of these crazy things that, luckily somebody else is working on them, but I think it's a very pragmatic, low-risk strategy for repairing that enzyme.
Question is, what percentage of patients with Parkinson's have this enzyme mutation?
It's been described in the literature up to 15%. So that is about 150,000 patients in the US. Well, Lou brought up something very interesting that he said that, in one of our studies, we actually showed that when we gave our drug to mice that had Parkinson's disease, that we were able to actually reverse it. And so this has never been shown before. This is a very unusual, and it was a really interesting finding. And this is an industry-accepted assay. So, Merck does it, Biogen, everybody does this assay. But we were able to actually show reversal. And then we looked at it in mice that didn't have that genetic defect, that genetic mutation. And we were also able to see improvements, increases in enzyme levels and improvements in the symptoms. And they were able to hang on this wire. It's called the wire hang test longer. So we think that if we pursue this strategy, that the drug will be, to a certain degree, helpful in other patients besides that narrowly defined genetic population.
I mean, what an amazing world we live in, right? We can take a drug, and see if a mouse can hang onto a wire long enough and tell from that it could potentially reverse a neurodegenerative disease. I mean, we live in interesting and amazing times. So. Yeah, Jeb, I don't want you to just sit there and look pretty and smile. Come on. What questions do you have for
Well,
Eric?
obviously, you've mentioned the size of the population, and you might mention kind of if the drug is successful, what kind of cost does it offset? What's the cost-benefit analysis for the healthcare system in general? Obviously, yes. Good news for the patient, but
yeah, it's a very good question. And the patients, this is a chronic, progressive, debilitating disease that affects not only the patient but the families of the patients. So it's devastating to these families. So the cost of treating these patients, there is really no drug today that can address Parkinson's disease. What's interesting about our approach is that you can actually do a genetic test. In some states, I think there are 3 or 4 states that do it at birth, just automatically see whether or not you have what's called a GBA1 mutation. If you have that GBA1 mutation, then you're flagged. You know to watch over time. You can speak with your physician, and your physician will know that you are at a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So our goal is to be able to detect these patients early, provide the drugs so that they have normal enzyme levels and they never have those symptoms. So that's really the way that we envision.
So it would be a preventative once-a-day pill, or what's the dosing that you're kind of thinking?
The way we think about it, it's very difficult to identify patients early on. Okay, so the way we think about it is basically slowing the progression of the disease. So if you're able to identify somebody, and by the way, this genetic mutation causes the most devastating form of Parkinson's disease with the earliest onset. So if you can catch them early, you can most likely avoid a very long course of disease.
Okay, and it is a once a day pill?
It's being designed today as once a day.
Okay.
Yes.
And so would this potentially eliminate the need for deep brain stimulation?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, or, depending on the patient, and I don't know which patients benefit from the deep brain stimulation. There may be combination strategies.
Early on, being
Yes.
able to catch it early on, so that.
And this is early, but what we have seen, and we've done some experiments, we've done some collaborations with pharmaceutical companies and academic centers, and we've published this data, is that this pathway for this enzyme is not only important for Parkinson's disease, it's also a culprit in Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, wow.
And we don't have the resources to study everything. We're focused on genetically defined population of Parkinson's disease, but our potential partners that we will likely work with to bring this product to market and commercialize it are very interested in those other indications. And that just it makes the market much, much larger.
So given like you pointed out, there's 3,000 studies on Parkinson's. Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia, and massively funded programs in that
Yes.
way. So might that suggest that, the ability to partner with someone sooner than later, and not necessarily at the end of a phase 2, but maybe what would be your guidance on that probability or possibility?
Yeah.
He does not provide any guidance on those such things in forward-looking
No,
statements.
excuse me. Yeah.
I got you back.
Luke can tell you. Look, this is very, very difficult to predict. Our focus is just making incremental headway every day, just making progress. This is also an area that Big Pharma has been burned in several times. So Sanofi had a drug that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on called Venglustat. It increased the levels of this enzyme, but the enzyme never got to the lysosome where it needed to be. So that program died. And there are many others like that with Big Pharma. So, it's always a learning experience. Luckily, our enzyme, our drug increases the enzyme levels and gets to the lysosome and improves lysosomal health, is what we call it. So there's a very high level of interest by Big Pharma. We have done some collaborations. That wire hang test was not our idea. It was one of the collaborators that asked us to do that assay. But I think they're going to look for safety data, because this is such a large population that they're going to be very focused on safety. And so once we have this phase 1 data, which will be later this year, I think that the discussions that we have ongoing now will really accelerate.
Well, certainly encouraging. You haven't had any signs so far.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're out of time, but I want to give you, out of respect, 30 seconds. Tell us the secret to anti-aging.
Well,
What would you say for everyone?
My wife tells me it's fat.
Anything else you want to add, end on before we break for that?
I would just say that, my background is in venture capital and starting biotech companies and really transformational companies. And this is why I like MDB so much, because I was trained, and the first job I had was working with Healthcare Ventures, a venture firm in New York, and we started a company called Genetic Therapy, Inc. back in 1987. It was the first gene therapy company. Just yesterday, I don't know if you saw, there was a gene therapy product approved. This is 35 years later. And we also started a company called Human Genome Sciences. It was the first company to sequence the human genome. And we started another company, which I ended up at, called MedImmune. This is in the antibody technology. We sold that company for $15.6 billion for a disease that no one even knew about, couldn't even spell, RSV. So what I like about Gain is I think it's going to be transformational in central nervous system disorders and in neurodegeneration. And that's really what excites me about it. And we're going to get through these clinical studies. We're going to, I'm very confident about the people that we have working there, but I do see a transformation in CNS. Just like Plano-based company you may know, Reata Pharmaceuticals, right? $7 billion acquisition, 5,000 patients per year. That's their market, is 5,000 patients. So think about the value of Parkinson's disease and talk about big market oppositions.
It's the asymmetric return potential that Jeb talked about in the beginning. So, well, thank you, Eric.
Thank you
Always
very
a pleasure.
much. Really appreciate it.
All right, you have 10 minutes to provide some feedback, grab some snacks, and we're going to end with the magic mushrooms. So.